All right, so this PowerPoint lecture slide is going to be about new imperialism. I put new in quotations there because I sort of question the extent to which imperialism is really new, though it's sort of different in some ways, as far geographically speaking. It's definitely different than sort of the old imperialism, the way the textbook likes to put it, and then sort of how this kind of leads to World War One. So let's get into it. Um, so I would, like it's kind of just briefly mentioned, I would question whether this is sort of new. Colonialism, as we've talked about it, starts in the 1500s as the age of exploration develops, and that sort of old imperialism that the textbook's going to sort of classify it as um, is going to be centered around the Americas and the discovery of the New World. So in most of that's going to be Spanish possessions. Now they're going to lose those American and South American possessions to Napoleon, and maintain some possessions in the Caribbean. Most probably importantly Cuba, but that until the Spanish-American War in 1898, which they'll lose that. The French are going to sort of lose their territory in the Americas to the British during the 7 Years' War in 1763, and that's a year that you really need to remember. So the 7 Years' War is a very, very sort of important sort of pivot point in international relations and sort of the power, international power up between British and the French. Napoleon's going to sell the territory that he gets from the Spanish to the United States, most notably, obviously, in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. The Dutch are going to lose their American holdings in the 16th century to England with like the Anglo-Dutch Wars that were part of like the English Civil War period. The Portuguese are going to lose Brazil in 1822. The British are going to really be, when we talk about imperialism, and really like the connections between like the age of exploration, the British are going to have the most consistent worldwide presence. Well, we're talking about the New World here specifically, but the British are going to dominate. And even though they lose the United States, they're going to have a presence in the Caribbean and in Canada, all the way through. Okay. If we talk about the Pacific and Indian Ocean and sort of like imperialism in Asia, the Spanish are going to be in the Philippines until the Spanish-American War, and then and after 1898, the Philippines get transferred to American control. The British are going to control Austria and New Zealand, and then obviously, it's further down, but the crown jewel of the British Empire ends up becoming India itself. Russia is going to be control of the North Pacific. However, they're going to sell Alaska to the United States in 1867, which ends up being somewhat relevant. We're going to see a fight over control of like Southeast Asia. The French are going to control Vietnam, otherwise known as Indochina. America is going to slowly sort of expand their presence in the Pacific. And so this is kind of like up until this late period in the 1880s and 1890s, and then moving forward into World War I, this is going to be kind of like the hallmark of it. And so then when we get into this sort of new imperialism, there's going to be much more of emphasis on Africa and Asia. And you may note here that like the Monroe Doctrine maybe is playing a small role in this, which we'll talk about a lot more in American history next year. But the Monroe Doctrine was that the United States kind of told Europe to stay on its own side of the Atlantic Ocean and to not meddle in the Americas and American or like business in the Americas. This round of imperialism is going to be definitely led by the British. It's very closely tied to the Industrial Revolution. It's also very closely tied to German unification. Okay, so those are probably the two biggest causes of this new imperialism. And so a lot of it's going to be based on like a military presence to essentially enforce free trade. Now I do think we'll talk a little bit about how um, European imperialism ends up being different than like American imperialism. And I think like that, even though this is an American history class, I do think the difference is important in understanding sort of like the long-term effects of imperialism, especially when you talk about how like American imperialism ends up being much more successful throughout the 1900s because they don't colonize. Um, and I think that that's relevant. Um, so if you look at this map here, and this is in the sort of world map in 1900, and you can see how much of the world was really controlled by different European countries. And like you see there, so by 1914, Europeans are going to control 84% of the world's territory, which is a huge increase, mostly because you don't necessarily realize just by looking at a map how sort of geographically large Africa is. But so like like that's the carving up of Africa after the Berlin Conference in 1884. Like that's really important. And we talk about Britain and sort of British Empire. They're going to control roughly 20% of the world territory and 25% of its population. So if you look at this map here in red, this is the extent to which the British Empire sort of gets before World War I. And I mean, obviously, they had like the famous saying that the sun never set on the British Empire, and it really was true. If we look at causes of imperialism, so I'm going to break these down into categories, okay? I think economically speaking, the Industrial Revolution is going to be hugely important because, well, for two reasons, really. One is it's going to cause an increase in demand for natural resources that fueled industrialization. For example, rubber, for tires, you had petroleum for gasoline, and then manganese for steel. The other most like the two biggest important causes of imperialism with industrialization is that they also realized very quickly that like one of the biggest problems for capitalistic economies is overproduction, and so like overproduction causes bigger economic downturns. And so what they realized is that like, hey, they could dump all of their excess goods onto like African and Asian markets, and that would help sort of limit these or lower these like cyclical depressions that had become sort of like a hallmark of capitalism and unregulated capitalism in the late 1800s and early 1900s. I mean, even in America too. And so I think those are probably the two biggest things. I also think that like consumerism does play a role in this. So like as more people got more money and you see a growth of the middle class, there's going to be an increase in like demand for like middle class goods, like non-essential goods that just like people wanted: coffee, sugar, cocoa, tea, and peanuts, all things that aren't indigenous to Europe. And so like these things do have an effect. If we talk about sort of political and military causes, steam-powered ships are going to be really important because for European navies, those steam-powered ships needed coal to power them. And so like you needed coaling stations in different parts of the world so that your navy could effectively sail around and have places to refuel. You're also going to see like aggressive nationalism, sometimes called jingoism, which like it becomes a competition. So like how many colonies or how many countries does your state control? And like that was a competition. It showed like your strength of your country based on how many colonies you had. And so those types of things are feeding into this. I think some will cite that like population growth here played a role, but that really isn't supported by facts. If we look at social causes, I really would like to actually change this where it would say like social justifications, because the real reason that imperialism becomes a thing is for economic and military gain. However, like as mass politics spread in the late 1800s, and more people become involved in the political process, and countries slowly become more democratic. They, like, politicians can't just go around saying like, hey, we want to go into Africa and exploit them and take advantage of them, steal their resources, dump all our extra crap on them, and basically take advantage of them. Like, as like like this, especially like when you talk about the growth of mass politics and like the spread of liberalism, um, in the 1800s, it's like that just doesn't gonna mesh with a lot of people. So what they do to justify their imperialism is they sort of cloak it in these sort of social reasons. So they say, well, we're going in to spread civilization. That like our presence will, we can spread schools, we can build hospitals and spread medical knowledge, we can develop infrastructure, we can build roads and hospitals and bridges, and we can show them how to, be a civilized country. Um, so like that's going to act as a justification for their actions. They're also going to say like use Christianity is that like, hey, we're going in here and like our presence is we're going to spread Christianity to these heathen people and that we're going to save their souls. And that those types of beliefs, like those two things, also are working because Europeans are going to develop a real sense of racial superiority that grows out of like the social Darwinist thinking is that like Darwin's theories of evolution are going to get bastardized and people are going to make the conclusions that like the survival of the fittest works on sort of like meta levels between civilizations when like that hasn't like that wasn't part of Darwin's initial ideas and that like certain races were superior to other races and that like some societies like were like more well adapted to like modern civilization than others and like which is all pseudoscience. I mean, none of it's true, but like that sort of fake science that they really buy into helps like develop this idea of like the white man's burden, which comes to like really characterize like this belief in like white superiority and like the duty that white people had to like go in and sort of like civilize these colored people of the world. You can see like the poem here. Um, it's talking about colored people as like half devil and half child, and that like white people, have to go and serve, others. And so, and again, just to make this point, is like this really isn't a real reason for imperialism. Like people aren't, like no European country is actually imperialistic because they're like have altruistic or like well-intended like reasons to like go in and do these things. The reason they're becoming imperialistic is 100% because they want to take advantage of economically and militarily of like resources and land. But they can't just be that blunt, and so they have to find ways, and this is one thing that they take advantage of. Now, if we look at other reasons that kind of help European imperialism be more successful, they had much more superior military technology. So the Maxim gun, which is the first machine gun, was invented during this time period. They had steel ships that could sail, like for example, that they could travel up the Nile and get into deeper parts of Africa. Especially as railroads spread and railroads get developed all across Africa. They also, during this time period, which helps show the spread of germ theory and like the scientific knowledge of the age, they develop a cure for malaria. Um, and those are outside enablers, just to be clear. Inside enablers, so things that happen inside of Africa, there's, if there is such a thing as too much diversity, this was in Africa that, like, if you there was, I think there was something like over like 1,000 different languages that were spoken across these countries, and so like there's way too much diversity to allow like massive unification movements, and because of like the superiority of like the military technology that European countries had, like these African kingdoms really would have had to unite in serious ways to be able to combat European forces effectively. Um, and like African um, tribes and kingdoms are never going to be united, and part of that's because of ethnic sort of strife between those tribes. There's also like religious differences that are going to be exploited, and kind of in a bad way. European imperialistic powers were really sort of good in a bad way about taking advantage of these and like using African people against each other, much like Americans were in the West when they would sort of utilize the differences between Native Americans to get them to fight against each other. So there's going to be a lot of faults in this. I mean, I think obviously this is a sort of scar on European history. We're going to see a lot of horrible things done in the name of like civilization, in the name of like progress. So there's going to be really brutal labor practices. They're going to spread drugs and alcohol among native peoples. I think the best example of that is like the opium wars that Britain fights with China to basically keep Chinese people addicted to opium during this time period. They're going to destroy native cultures and languages, religions, and sort of this like forced conversion process, both culturally and religiously. There's not going to be really any permanent European civilizations except in South Africa, and so like there's going to be no development. So like even though they're going to go in and say like, hey, like we're going to civilize these people, that really never happens because there's no real settlement. They just basically exploit the economic resources there and land for military reasons in some instances, but there's no sort of coordinated effort to really like try to improve the country in of itself. And so like there's huge amounts of money that are drained from Africa. I mean, massive amounts. And much of like the disparity in wealth in the world today, and like why Africa and parts of Asia are so much worse off than the Western world is, I mean, you just look at this. I mean, this is the reason why. I mean, we basically drain Africa of its wealth. So where this starts, okay, so the sort of process of this sort of new, let me put that in sort of air quotes, imperialism is going to start in the late 1870s and lead all the way up into World War I. Much of this sort of like new scramble is caused both by, like we talked about, sort of the Industrial Revolution and the effects of the Industrial Revolution, but also really importantly, German unification. And it's because of German unification that like this becomes a hot issue in the 1870s, because what's going to happen is that Germany is going to want to have colonies. So like Germany, when it unites, instantly becomes a very strong economic force. They start building up their military. They want to they in their minds, and rightfully so, they're a European power, and they want to have colonies like the other European powers did. And so what ends up happening is there's a lot of agitation between like Germany, Britain, France about who's got what. And so they call the Berlin Conference in 1884 so that they can sit down and establish sort of like spheres of influence. So like each country kind of gets its own part, and they're going to negotiate who gets what so that like nobody fights wars over it. Now, importantly, there's no African rulers at this meeting, so they basically sit down and carve up Africa without any consent of African people. And what's interesting is that, like, you can, from a European's perspective, this is a mostly successful event. Like, they take almost complete control of Europe. There are only two countries in the start of World War I that were independent. From they go basically 40 plus years of, or 30 years of this sort of arrangement in Africa without having any kind of serious war that breaks out between the two of them. And so you can kind of see the map here in the changes of European imperialism in the late 1800s and how that really changes greatly. And I mean, just look at the colors of the map here, and how much more of Africa is claimed by European countries. So if you want to go through each of these countries, we'll kind of go one by one, and I'll go quickly through this. So like this expansion, France and Britain are originally going to be in conflict, most importantly over access to Egypt because of the Suez Canal. But France is really going to focus on like northern Africa. But what's going to end up happening is that there's going to be more conflict between France and Germany, and that's going to bring France and Britain together eventually. We'll talk about that later. Italy, not really all that important. Belgium. Belgium's really only important because of how horrible they were. So like Belgium is most often used as like King Leopold is the example used to show just like the worst of the worst, of like the like atrocities that were committed. And you kind of have this quote. They said like male rubber tappers and porters were mercilessly exploited and driven to death. Leopold's agents held wives and children of these men hostage until they returned with their rubber quotas. Those who refused or failed to supply enough rubber often had their villages burned down, children murdered, and their hands cut off. And you see pictures of that here. So like the Belgians were like most notorious for doing ruthless and horrible sort of torture techniques to exploit African people. Um, yeah, I mean that's what you need to know about Belgium. Germany, okay, so Germany wanted to have a sort of horizontal belt across Central Africa that would connect the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, and they wanted to run a railroad across that. Even though Bismarck was kind of slow to get on board with this, is that like obviously everyone else is getting rich on this, and like I said, much of this sort of like Berlin Conference, for example, directly tied to like Germany wanting more land, especially like in uh, Central Africa. And the black is what the German countries in the map. Britain. Okay, so the British, obviously the most important and like the most, they had the most territories and are most active, I guess. And what the British were different is that they wanted a vertical um, sort of line of colonies north and south so that they could run a railroad line from north to south all the way from the Cape of Good Hope to the Mediterranean Sea. And so like that was their goal. Um, and so like they'll fight a series of wars um, throughout the late 1800s. Some of these, like the Anglo-Zulu War, are really interesting as far as like the Zulu Wars, as the British actually get defeated by a native population before um, the British eventually take control. The Boer Wars are really interesting because the Boer Wars um, in South Africa is that they originally had been like Dutch, and there's differences with religion. They find diamonds there, so then that becomes a huge craze. And the British are really horrible to um, the Boers in that war. Um, and I think like that's really all you need to know. Then I wouldn't underestimate the importance of the Suez Canal. We'll talk about that in World War I and World War II, how important that is. All right, so let's talk a little bit about colonization of Asia. Japan, okay, so Japan had for um, a long time been closed off to outsiders. Now America kind of changes that because Americans show up in 1853 and basically tell Japan like, hey, you either are going to trade with us or we're going to fight a war against you. And so the Japanese decide to not fight in the war and open up to outside trade. So from 1850 moving forward, Japan was open to outside trade, just never formally colonizing. Like we're never colonized. And it actually eventually, like Japan is, that's going to be important that Japan chooses to like trade with outsiders and then go through that westernization process, because that's going to lead over time to like Japan becoming a Pacific empire, which I mean is one of the like causes of World War II, at least in the Pacific theater. With China, we've talked a lot about like the Opium Wars. China is going to be really important because moving forward is that Japan is going to want control of China. And what happens is that the European countries step in to kind of protect Chinese independence only because they saw like the economic gain in it. So what ends up happening is that these different European countries, along with Japan, set up like what are called spheres of influence, where like each country gets this little like pocket of like economic access to China. So each country had its own sphere of influence where they could trade freely with China and other countries would stay out. Now, what's going to be important about this is that like America gets left out of this like sphere of influence in China. So like America never gets its own sort of area in China, and so they basically work to break this down. And what America ends up doing is they advocate for an open door policy. And so like this open door policy is what's going to be like the dominant sort of economic model in China, where, and this is going to be like American imperialism sort of at its core, is that like they don't necessarily want to colonize, they just want access to markets, and they're just trying to make money. Um, and that's going to be, like I said, kind of like the hallmark there of American imperialism. Now, what's going to happen is that the Chinese are actually going to fight against this colonization, sort of quasi-colonization, imperialization, and they're going to have a rebellion in 1900, and American and British troops are going to put that down. So if you look at spheres of influence here, this is what I'm talking about. So see Japan with the purple there. The British had the two areas here in green. The French had the area in orange. They also had the French Indochina, which is essentially Vietnam. And so, you know, different areas had their own little pockets. Now, India is going to become, well, I don't know if I should say that. Well, I mean, India is going to be the crown jewel of the British Empire, and it's going to be hugely important for British wealth and prosperity. And that like this is a slow process of sort of British supremacy in India and the British sort of takeover. I mean, by the time that you get to 1858, the British government's almost in complete control, and you have, what's ironic about this, you have roughly 1,000 British people ruling over 350 million Indian people. And so like the British are going to use India both as a way to produce goods, but also India is going to be super important, because if you think about that, that's 350 million consumers that British companies can export their goods to now, and that it was really only British goods that were finding their way into India, or they were at least the cheapest. And so like that mass consumption of goods by Indian people of British goods is really going to help British industrialization. I guess like Afghanistan we'll talk about later. We'll come back to that actually way farther down the road with the Cold War. We'll talk about Indochina again, because Vietnam becomes a big thing after World War II. New Zealand and Austria not all that important. All right, so if we look at sort of the consequences of this, obviously the huge economic exploitation of Africa and Asia. You see that this political cartoon here up on the top left here, where you see all the money stacked on Europe and the huge sort of crater that created in Africa. Like I think that's a great representation of like the economic realities of imperialism and why you know there's such a great disparity in wealth in the world today. You can also see that like what's going to end up happening is that like the problems that poverty causes is like you have people, you have worse healthcare, you have worse schools, you have people doing crazy things for money because resources are tight and most people are poor, so it causes corruption and crime. And so like all of these problems that poverty creates were like further contribute to social Darwinism because they're like, like the Europeans, as they're prospering off of sort of African and Asian, either consumption or resources, they can look at these Asian or African countries and look at how much they were struggling, and they say, oh, well, look, it's because white people are superior to colored people, and like you just look at what's happening. It's like we're prospering during this time of industrialization, and whether it's African people or Asian people are really struggling. It just shows how much superior or how much more superior white people are to colored people, which just kind of helps feed this sort of bullcrap social Darwinist thinking that some people are better than others. And also importantly is going to redraw the borderlines in Africa. This is going to be really important later on because what's going to happen is these at the Berlin Conference in 1884 when they sit down and they draw all these lines like saying Britain you get this, France you get this, it's going to cause weird lines to be established. Okay, sorry I got interrupted there. So just to be clear, like this redrawing of lines is going to be really important because they're going to draw lines that really don't reflect the differences between like African populations and different ethnic groups, different religious groups, all that kind of stuff. And so it's going to put groups of people together that didn't want to be together, and like that eventually is going to cause, like the Rwandan genocides, for example, during the 1990s were because two different ethnic groups who hated each other got forced into being in the same country, and one ethnic group tried to exterminate the other ethnic group. So, like overall, imperialism just has a really horrible effect on Africa. Obviously, it has a positive effect, sort of economically speaking, with the prosperity in Europe. But even, I mean, if you look at even the short-term effects of this, I mean, you can definitely tie World War I right to imperialism because of the alliances it's going to develop and rivalries that are going to kind of heat up and agitate this sort of international scene. It's going to increase nationalism, which is going to be one of the big reasons that World War I breaks out. I mean, so this is definitely a huge contributing factor in World War I. So, all in all, I'm not sure it's a good thing.